Hello, I'm the 10-minute English teacher and you're here to revise Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol for GCSE English Literature. Today we're thinking about Stave 2 and the Ghost of Christmas Past. Okay, we've got an action trail here for Stave 2. Your job is to think about exactly what happens between the beginning and the end of the chapter. So it starts with Scrooge waking to a strange light, and at the end of the chapter, like he likes to, he falls asleep again. So after Jacob Marley leaves at the end of the first stave, Scrooge falls asleep, and at the end of this chapter he falls back to sleep in the same fashion. So what happens in between? I'm about to tell you, but if you want to try and rack your own brain, pause the video now and have a little bit of a go at writing down all those key moments that you can remember in that chapter. So, Stave 2. It starts with Scrooge waking up to a strange light, and then he discovers that he's being visited by the Ghost of Christmas Past. The Ghost of Christmas Past takes Scrooge to visit his school days. So he sees himself as a child at his boarding school, being greeted by his younger sister Fan, who's come to pick him up at Christmas time. And there's also a little bit of a hint there that Scrooge might have been abused. He's been at the very least mistreated in that context. When his schoolmaster shakes Scrooge's hand, it has a really negative effect on him. And that's maybe Dickens hinting at young Scrooge being really poorly treated in that place. We're starting to pity the character here. It's quite clever. We're starting to feel a bit sorry for Scrooge. He's then taken to see himself as a slightly older young adult, and he's an apprentice to someone called Fezziwig. And his old boss, Fezziwig, is treating not only Scrooge, but all his employees and the locals really nicely and putting on a great Christmas party. And it makes Scrooge start to think about Bob Cratchit and the way that he treats him. So he's actually starting to think about others. He's earlier on mentioned in this chapter, mentioned the boy who sang a carol at his door. Now he's thinking about Bob Cratchit and the way he treats him. The next part of Scrooge's past life that we're taken to see is with his old fiancée, whose name is Belle, and she's leaving him. She's saying, look, you're too greedy, you're too interested in money, I'm off. Then Scrooge sees her again. He's had enough at this point. He's quite affected by all these visions, and he's had enough for the night. But the ghost says, no, one more thing. And they go and see Belle again. This time, she's a happily married mother, and her husband comes home and says, you'll never guess who I've just seen, your old mate Scrooge. His partner Jacob Marley's on his deathbed, and he's over there at work on Christmas Eve, of all things. And that really affects Scrooge. To know that he's missed out on having a family and sharing his life with somebody and having his own children and having somebody to share his life with really affects him. And he says, why do you delight to torture me so? Which is interesting, because he's come to realise what love and family is all about already, considering that Fred popped in earlier in the novella and said, why don't you come for Christmas? And he said, oh, well, why did you get married? At the end of the chapter, he's so distressed, old Scrooge, that he pushes down what's called the extinguisher, but funny little hat, on the Ghost of Christmas Past, squashes him down, and then, like you would do if you've just gone through all that, you fall straight to sleep. And that is Stave 2. If you're aiming for the top band in the response, and you really want to show you that you can be conceptualised and clever, one of the things you could do is talk about this opposition of light and darkness in the novella. A novella just sounds a bit swanky. It just means little novel. If you call it a novel, you know, you're not going to get into too much trouble, but you want to show that you've got some really great key terminology up your sleeve, and that's another way in. So here's a model response from me. The novella is about darkness versus light. Scrooge is firmly associated with darkness in the opening, which contrasts him with this ghost, the Ghost of Christmas Past. And that's a character he needs to learn from. So we've got this binary opposition in the novel, and these characters clearly contrast each other. Scrooge needs to learn from these ghosts and be more like them in some ways. Certainly the first two of the three spirits that come and visit him, and that shows that, you know, that it's emphasising that idea that Scrooge needs to change. Here are some key quotes for the chapter that are definitely worth you learning. So we've got Darkness was cheap and Scrooge liked it. Now that is actually from chapter 1 and it's actually about Scrooge. But if you think about what we've said about the idea of darkness and light, we're associating Scrooge with darkness and evil and sin and punishment in the afterlife. This ghost turns up, white, wearing white, light's pouring out of him. So you can start talking about how this ghost contrasts Scrooge. If you're walking into the exam or into your mock and you've got all these wonderful Scrooge quotes that you will have learned, and then the question in front of you is about one of the ghosts, oh no. Well, no, not so. You can just do some comparisons. So long as you're making sure that every paragraph you're writing is bringing in comments and exploration of the focus of the question. This one wears a tunic of purest white. The idea of pure and white has got sort of allusions to heaven. Ultimately, we know what Scrooge is facing if he doesn't change. He's facing that punishment in the afterlife that Jacob Marley's suffering. This ghost is like a child, yet not so like a child as an old man. Now, when we think of children, they're innocent and not confrontational. They're not, Scrooge is meant to be able to learn from this ghost. So he's not meant to be deeply afraid by this visitor. That comes later. And not so like a child as an old man. So it's like a child, this ghost, don't be scared. But also like an old man, pay attention. We associate the elderly with wisdom to impart. Why do you delight to torture me so? That's what Scrooge says when he sees that vision of Belle, and it really affects him. It really hurts him, and he's going through great pain, like thinking about what's happened in his past. But also, this question shows that Scrooge hasn't quite yet come to that full understanding of what life means and how he should treat others. He's not quite managed to get to find that redemption that he needs to. And we've also got this wonderful little quote. The ghost, every now and again in this chapter, just has a slightly wry comment or a slightly ironic sort of thing to say that makes Scrooge start to question who he is. Small matter to make these silly folks so full of gratitude, is what the ghost says to Scrooge when they're watching people enjoy themselves at Fezziwig's ball. And Scrooge challenges the ghost. So it's showing the reader that Scrooge is actually starting to reflect, starting to change. Okay, check out my other videos on my channel. I'll continue to add content. Feel free to ask for something you'd like to see me cover in the content section, or explain another moment that you think is important that I might not have spoken about or mentioned today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and keep revising. Thank you for joining me.